Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to grecochess, the YouTube channel of chess. I'm your host. My name is Karilos Series, and we have a special video. If you've seen the previous videos, we were facing the chess.com bots, starting from poor Marty, whose rating was 250, and after surviving and going through all the beginner and intermediate bots, we're facing now the advanced. Out of the 20 advanced bots, we have survived. We have gone through 16 of them, the most recent being Lee from Taiwan, rating 2000. But before we continue with the bots, something special. If you've seen the previous videos, some time ago, I had organized a chess.com online tournament called grecochess with 16 players starting, and let's share with you the details of the tournament. Here we are. 16 players. The tournament started September 27th, 2025, as soon as we had 16 participants. And they were divided into four groups of four. Excuse me, 4 groups of 4 with time control 3 days. The winners of the 4 groups went to the final round. And in the end, the winner was user ID Barak7. His name is Barak Shafrir, from Israel. Second place went to Maxim Govoruka from the Ukraine, and third place went to my skin from Italy. Congratulations once again to Barak for the win. And a few days ago, I had the chance to interview him. We discussed, the two of us, about chess, about his life. And in another video that I recently published, you can see that interview, and I'm going to put the link in the description. But during the interview, I asked Barak if he has any game that is his favorite that he'd like to share with us, and he selected a game against Mukel Roze, a game that was played over the board. During the interview, he went briefly through the game, but we ran out of time. And then he emailed me the score sheet of the game, plus what happened in the end, because the game went for too long, and in the end, the players did not record the last few moves. A summary of what happened. And I'm delighted. I'm going to share the game with you. But first, a few things about Barak. His rating, his daily rating of chess.com is 1794, which places him in the 0.1 percentage, the top 7,614 players. And among my chess.com friends, he is number one. And we're going now to the analysis board of chess.com to enter the moves. As usual, chess.com, the computer of chess.com will give us a numerical evaluation, will give us a symbol as a kind of a comment for the move, which would have been the best move, and the top 5 moves for the other player. And Barak had the white pieces, and his opponent Mukel had the black pieces. And we are ready to start. And Barak starts by pushing his pawn to d4. This is one of the top moves for white to begin the game. Usually, many players start with the e-pawn like myself. Then d4 is another one. You may have the English opening, a third choice. The Diretti, knight f3, or maybe the hyper-modern pawn to g3. Or if you really want to surprise your opponents, you can have something like pawn going to b3. This can be quite tricky if you catch your opponent unprepared. And the top answers for black is either pawn to d5, that's what I usually do, or what Barak did, knight to f6, the Indian game. Here it is, before it was the queen's pawn opening, and now it's called the Indian game. Both are book moves. You see this little book. Moves have been extensively analyzed in theory, and they are not supposed to surprise the opponent. And now, Barak's second move, the Trompovsky. It's not among the top 5 here, but it's quite known. Bishop to g5. Another book move. What is the goal of that? If you change with f6 the way things are now, then you double black's pawns. But Mukel doesn't want the pawns double, pushes the pawn to e6. what's happening is that if Barak decides to exchange, queen goes here, there are no double pawns. On the other on the other side, the problem is that the knight on f6 is pinned, so if it's attacked or if it's accidentally moved, then black can lose their queen. So Barak is trying to attack the knight by sending the pawn to e4. If it's allowed to go one more square to e5, the knight can be lost, because if it's not moved, it doesn't move. So if it's not moved, it's taken by the pawn. If it's moved, the queen is lost. But Mukel decided to stop it with a pawn to h6. What's happening is that, as you may see here, the knight cannot take the pawn, even though the pawn is unprotected, because then the queen is lost. But now with the pawn going to h6, things differ a little bit, because Barak is in the following dilemma. If he doesn't take the knight, if he goes back, he loses the pawn. If he sends it to h4 to keep the pin, pawn goes to g5, bishop needs to move again to g3, and now there is no pin and the pawn is lost. So the only way to stop the losing of the pawn is exchange on f6, and that's what the two players do. Move number 5 now. Until now, every move was book move. Book number 5, Barak decided to attack the queen with a pawn to e5. It is only the fourth top move, as you see here. This move, of course, it looks as if it's good because it attacks the queen. The computer says good, but when the computer says good, it usually means not so good. Otherwise, it would be at least an excellent. What is the problem? Assuming that black does not fall asleep and leave the queen on f6. Of course, black loses a tempo, a move, because they have to move the queen. But other than that, look at the d5 square. White does not control it, so it's black disposal. Black can put any piece they like, and it is safe for now. But first, let Mukel save the queen, goes back to d8, where it started. Ideally, it's on e7 the best, although the difference is not that big. We finished top 5, the first 5 moves. What is the score? And Barak is leading by 0.2. Very small, means almost nothing at this point. Let's continue. Barak develops the knight of 3, and Mukel, that's what we said about d5, can push the pawn to d5 and gain better control of the center, gain more space, and Barak doesn't have the pawn on e4 to take it. Of course, Barak can take en passant, but either now or never. In en passant, you can only do it the first time you have the chance, but then the pawn will be lost, most likely the queen or the bishop. In fact, most likely the bishop and then the queen. Whatever, even with this pawn, we don't like it because of the doubling, but in any case, black has better control of the center. That's why Barak is not going to take en passant. Instead, Barak will push the pawn to c4. You may say the pawn is going to be lost, yes, but if Mukel takes it, the bishop takes here, and materially we're the same, but white had a chance to develop a bishop for free. You don't want to do that. Instead, Mukel will send his pawn to c5. Computer would rather have the bishop to b4 to be in front of the pawn. c5 is just good. Of course, now Barak is not going to take the pawn because the bishop takes back, and it's exactly the opposite of what happened before. You don't win material and you only help your opponent develop their bishop. What's happening at this point is that both players will exchange on d5. And then Barak checks from b5. And what can Mikhail do? Either pin a piece to answer the check, or the worst case is move the king to e7. In fact, the second worst. The worst is put the queen on d7. You see here, you lose your queen for the bishop. Or otherwise, the king to e7 is one of the worst. The top ones are here. And actually, Mukel goes with the top move, knight to c6. But now the knight is pinned. And Mukel better be careful for this knight. Knight to c3 for Barak, that develops the other knight. And bishop to e6 to Mukel, that develops the lateral bishop and also gives more protection to the d5 pawn. We finished 10 moves with the score 0.23 for Barak. Let's continue. Short castling for Barak, part of the opening to make sure you castle. Bishop to e7 for Mukel. Rook to c1 for Barak. Wants to exert pressure on the knight. Of course, his own knight and the pawn in the middle, but you never know. Also wants to control the semi-open C file. It's called semi-open because there is only one black pawn, no white pawns on this file. Ideally, rooks, as I've mentioned before, what they love is open files if they can't find them semi-open. And also, as far as ranks are concerned, but this is mostly near the end of the game, the white rook wants the 7th rank and the black rook wants the 2nd rank. And Mukel is going to block this file with pawn to c4. So telling basically Barak, look, yes, your rook is in the semi-open file, but can only go until c3. And now Barak sends his queen to a4, the first inaccuracy of the game. It looks tempting because the knight on c6 cannot move. It's attacked once, defended once. What if it's just attacked a second time? You could win at least a pawn. If perhaps if black does nothing, then here you'll go on to see what's happening. Take, check. Okay, then bishop will go back, and then you win the pawn. Any of the two pawns. d5 would be the best because the center or the b7. If queen tries to block it instead of the bishop, then the queen on c6 will take the rook on a8. But this is only if black ignores what's happening. And black is not going to ignore it, will defend the pawn the second time the queen going to c7. But the computer thinks it's a mistake. Computer would rather have the queen, would rather have the short castle. And I was thinking, why don't you get a free pawn? And let's see what would happen if we had the short castle. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, queen takes pawn. And now the bishop can attack the queen. But now, no, the bishop can attack the queen, but then you lose your second pawn on d5. It's true that white can keep the pawn. Let's see once again what's happening if we have castling. Takes. The computer does not even recommend this. And you see here the computer says, if black castles, white better push the b3 pawn instead of trying to win the pawn. Maybe rook can go to c8. Black will have to think where to put the queen, and white will have where to place the queen, and after a few moves, black might even be able to place the rook on b8 and win the pawn on b2. White will have to struggle with the queen. Black has completed castling, and that is why the computer thinks that even if temporarily you lose a pawn, it's better if you castle. But in any case, that is redundant because, as we mentioned before, black plays the queen on c7. And now Barak pushes a pawn to b3. What is his goal? Why did he do it? Good as a computer. He wants one way or the other to get rid of these pawns here, so and then remove the knight from c3, so the rook hits the knight c6. The knight on c6 is going to be pinned against the queen. Before it was pinned against the king, it's still pinned against the king, but now it's also going to be pinned against the queen. Let's see what's going to happen. And Mukel takes a pawn on b3. computer thinks are great. It's a risky one. Really, you have to think about the pin that may emerge. And Barak takes with his a2 pawn on b3. Computer would rather have it taken by the queen, and you may be wondering what is the difference. I think the difference is because you want your queen to go back to the game and not be stuck in the edge of the board and perhaps in danger of being attacked. And if you go to the end game, the pawn, whether on the A or the B file, is an outside pawn, but you want it to be as outside as possible. Castling for Mukel. Finally, Mukel castled. And we finished 15 moves. And what is the score? Barak is leading by 0.15. Let's continue the game. And now Barak sends his knight to e2, and now the knight on c6 until a move ago it was castled against the, excuse me, it was pinned against the king. Now it's pinned against the queen. Rook goes from f8 to c8. What's happening is after that, look at the situation of the poor knight on c6. It's attacked 1, 2, 3 times. Let's do the arrows again. 1, 2, 3 times. Defended twice. Once, twice. And it cannot move, otherwise thing is lost. So black needs to support it. How to support it? One way is the bishop go to d7. Another way is to put the rook on c8. And Mukel decided to place his rook from f8 to c8. Computer thinks it's an excellent move, but the best would have been from A to C, the other rook. Why? Because now the result is twofold. First of all, the rook on A has very little freedom, only one square to go. And second, you don't want to take a piece away from the king's defense. Let's continue. Knight to f4 for Barak that wants to push his pieces. And pawn to a6 to Mukel that wants to threaten the bishop. Basically poses the question to the bishop. And Barak is in the dilemma. If he takes a knight, then there is no pin any longer. You lose whatever advantage the pin could give you. If you send it back, the pressure on the knight is much less. What can we do in this case? So the best thing to do is avoid the question. Do something else to postpone the dilemma. And what is something else? Knight takes on e6. What can which is the best move on the computer? What can Mukel do? If he ignores it and takes the bishop, knight takes queen, pawn takes queen, knight takes pawn, threatens the bishop, and white has won at least a pawn. You see here, 293 will be white's advantage if pawn takes on b5, the original threat. Instead, Mukel plays the best possible answer. Pawn from f7 goes to e6. But now Barak has to deal with this question. No more going around through the question. Beating around the bush, I think, is an American expression, something like that. And what can he do? Takes a knight. And how can how can Mukel take back the knight? Definitely not with a queen, because then the rook takes the queen. Only one other way, the pawn from b7 goes to c6. But what's the pawn situation after these exchanges? Because when you exchange, you should not only think about material balance, but also what is the emerging situation, especially if there is no material balance change. You see here that black has two weak pawns, the isolated on a6 and the backward on c6. Why are they called like that? Isolated in a6 because there's only one neighboring file, the b file, and there is no pawn there to protect it. The C is backward because on the neighboring D file there is a pawn D5, but the D5 he cannot protect C6. Pawns cannot go backward, so the C6 pawns will need to advance at least 2 squares to C4 to fill the protection of D5, and this is not possible. Isolated and backwards pawns are weak pawns, which means that they can only be defended by pieces, so the side that is fighting against them, they can push all their firepower towards the weak pawn, hopefully to get it, and end up in a winning ending. But also, things are not so bad for black for Mukel because white Barak also has his weaknesses. B3 is also isolated pawn, and backward pawn is d4. So both players need to protect their weak pawns and attack the opponent's back pawns. How will they do it? Let's see. Rook to c2 for Barak. He wants to double his rooks on the c file. The semi-open and attacks the c6 pawn. Queen to b6 for Mukel. Inaccuracy is the computer, but what's the reason behind it? You don't want to end up a combination where the only way to take on c6 is the queen, only to face a white rook. That is why now black has two ways to take back on c6, whether with the rook on c8, ideally, or with the queen on b6. 20 moves have passed. What is the balance? What is the score? White Barak leads by 0.58. It is a little bit significant and not that crucial yet. If it doesn't go up, it's not easy to win the game, but it can easily go up. Rook goes from f1 to c1 for Barak, no surprises, doubling on the semi-open c file. And queen to b5 for Mukel. Inaccuracy says the computer. And finally, Barak's lead exceeds the 1 point. And now we start a series of exchanges. And you're going to see where this is going to lead to, because currently we are starting with equal material. Both sides have a queen, two rooks, one light piece, and six pawns. Whites are a little bit better, the pawns, because they belong in two islands. One is here, and the second is this 5. While black has 3 islands. This is the one, this is the second, and this is the third. Ideally, the fewer pawn islands you have, the better. But let's see what happens after the exchanges. Rook to c6 for Barak. And of course, Mukel is not going to take the queen, because if he takes the queen, rook takes rook check, takes rook, rook takes rook, king goes, for example, f7, pawn takes queen, and white is ahead by a rook. Instead, rook takes rooks for Mukel. Rook takes rook again for Barak, and now Mukel cannot take the rook because then he loses the queen. What is he's going to do? King to f7, so at least he's not having to worry about any checks. Pawn to h4 for Barak, basically saying enough what we could do in the queen side, let's see if we can expand on the king side and get more space. Rook to b8 for Mukel, that by doing so offers the a pawn to Barak. Barak is already ahead by a pawn and is going to win a second. After the exchange of the queens, 25 moves have been completed, by the way, and now Barak's advantage is 0.77. Still less than 1, but he has a slightly better position. Rook takes on a6, no surprise. Now Barak, for one moment, is ahead by 2 pawns, but Mukel takes on b3 and minimizes the difference to 1 pawn. You see here, Barak was lucky or thoughtful to push the pawn to h4 because now there is no threat of a back rank mate. Let's continue. Pawn to h5. Barak wants to push the pawn even more and not to be attacked by the bishop on e7. And Mukel will check from h1, king goes to h2, and sends his rook to d1 to put pressure on the d4 pawn. Currently, the knight on f3 protects it, but by doing so, the knight on f3 is immobilized. Let's continue. And Barak thought that if it was a wonderful idea to push the h-pawn, why not also push the g-pawn to g4, but which the computer does not like it. Inaccuracy, because this leaves the knight on f3 very weak. Rook to d3 for Mukel, attacks the knight. King goes to g2 to defend it. Rook to c3 for Barak. And we finish the first 30 moves. Barak is leading by 0.95. What's the case? Both sides have a rook. Both rooks are on open files. There are a total of 3 open files, A, B, C. One is occupied by the white rook, the other by the black, and the third is completely empty. One light piece each of them. Knight for Barak, bishop for Mukel. Pawns, 5 for Barak, 4 for Mukel. No passed pawn, but not only Barak has one more pawn, but he has one pawn island. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. While Mukel has 2 pawn islands, 1 and 1. Which means that under favorable, the certain conditions, under favorable conditions, Barak would start exchanges that would result with a remaining passed pawn. Not so easy, but it's possible. Now Barak sends a rook to e7 to pin the bishop on e7, but Tuchel doesn't like it, sends his king to f8. Rook to a8 check, king goes to f7. Knight to e1 for Barak, that wants to activate the knight. Rook goes to c4 and attacks the pawn on d4. Knight goes back to 3. Rook now goes to c7 to give support to the bishop on e7 so it cannot be pinned again. King to g3 for Barak that wants to push the king upwards. Rook to c3 for Mukel, that's pins the knight, and now at this point we have completed the first 35 moves. Barak still has a small advantage of 0.78, but unless this goes up, it's not easy to win the game. Let's continue. King to f4 for Barak and pins the knight and wants to put the king near the action. Rook to c2 for Mukel. King goes back to g3 for Barak. Rook to c3 for Mukel. Rook to e2 for Barak. We're almost threefold repetition. So Barak wants to provide support to the f2 pawn without having his king stuck on g3. Rook to c4 for Mukel. King to f4 for Barak that wants to put his king near the action. And bishop to c5 for Mukel. Computer thinks it's inaccuracy, but now look at the case. The pawn on d4 is attacked twice by the rook and by the bishop, defended only by the knight. And also the pawn cannot take the bishop because of the pin. Rook goes to d2 for Barak to provide more protection to the d4 pawn. Bishop to e7 for Michel that does not want to rely on the pin to save the bishop, does not want suddenly to lose a bishop. Pawn to g5 for Barak wants to push, push, push. Inaccuracy in the computer. When Barak was pushing the h pawn, computer was saying they're the best. When he pushes the g pawn, computer says inaccuracies. Okay. But before we did this, did we mention the score? 0.85 advantage for Barak after the first 40 moves. After the pawn is pushed, we have exchanges of pawns and exchanges of light pieces. And after White's 43rd move, both sides have a rook, and White gets 4 pawns versus 3 pawns for Mukel. No passed pawn yet. Also, you may have heard that Victor Kosnoy, past challenger for the World Championship, in fact, the finalist, once said, but with lots of exaggeration, that all rook endings are drawn. This is not too true, of course, but with rooks, it's much easier to get a draw if you're behind. Let's see what would happen if the rooks would disappear. Then it's black's turn to move. So what can black do? If he cannot do the 3 pawns that remain, he cannot be moved. If the other pawn is moved, then it's lost. If the king moves, it gets to stay f8 to g8 to keep the pawn. Then the white king goes to g6. And white has a lot of tempi with the f2 pawn, so white is easily winning if the rooks will suddenly disappear. That's why white would love to have the rooks exchange, black should not. You never exchange for the exchange of sake of exchange. You have to think what will happen after the exchange. So he is not 100% sure white will win, but white has a much easier task. And it's not certain that with rooks game is drawn, but at least there is hope for black. Let's see how the game continues. Rook to c8 for Mukel, just good moves the computer. Rook to b2 for Barak wants to be again in an open file. Rook to c7 for Barak, and the computer says it is a mistake. It's not easy. Why? So suddenly from 0.26 went to 2.98. Computer would rather have the rook to go to c1. Yes, you want your rook to control pawns from the back, whether it's yours or your opponent's. Of course, currently there are no yet passed pawns, but the pawn on h5 could become very dangerous. That's why the computer would rather have the rook go to c1 and then perhaps to h1 or to f1. Let's see how game continues. Pawn to h6 for Barak. Computer says it's a miss. Here the pawns will be exchanged and white will lose whatever advantage they have from the outside pawn. If the rook goes on h1, perhaps to go to h6, apply pressure, who knows what. So now Mukel will take the pawn on h6. We completed 45 moves, and what is the score? Barak barely is ahead, just 0.22, almost nothing. Of course, Barak will take back the pawn. And Barak's king now is a little bit offside. Barak has an extra pawn, but Mukel has a better king's position. Rook goes to a7 for Mukel, which the computer thinks a mistake. Would rather have it go to c3 to control and not make it easy for the f pawn to advance. It might go to f4, but then the rook goes to f3 and it's going to capture it. And now that there's no rook on c3 to stop, Barak sends his pawn to f4. We finish this 47th move of white, and that's where the score sheet ends. The players get too little time to record the remaining moves. You see that until 46th move of white, the game was almost even, 0.14 for white, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, the endings are very tricky. A move from black that seems almost inconspicuous, as they say, is not an obvious blunder. Black is not leaving a piece on praise or is allowing a combination, nothing like that. Just moves the rook, has the wrong idea for where to place the rook. Basically wants to avoid a check. That's my feeling. And that's all that white needs to have an advantage of 4.28. At this point, before we go to the review, we are going to read what Barak emailed to me. Barak said the following. I navigated my rook to the back rank, captured the backward pawn, and mated on the back rank with the opposition king. Basically, what this means, what I think he means, let's share once again the chessboard, is that eventually the rook ended on the 8th rank. The backward pawn, of course, is e6. One way or the other was able to apply more pressure there than what black could withstand, and won the pawn, and then force the black king to be at the 8th rank until the checkmate. But let's give a look at the review. First of all, Barak, congratulations once again, both for winning the tournament and for winning this game. And thanks to all the work that you've been doing as a chess teacher, I'm sure that the schools where you teach will appreciate it very much, and especially the students. And let's go to the review. Here we are. No brilliancies, great moves. Two for Barak, one for Mukel. Four books each of them, 19 best each of them. Excellent, 6 for Barak, 4 for Mukel. Good, 10 for Mukel, 7 for Barak. And the negatives, 4 inaccuracies for Barak, 3 for Mukel, 2 mistakes for Barak, 5 for Mukel, and 3 misses for Barak. And percentage-wise, 87.6 for Barak and 85.2 for Mukel. You see that most of the game Barak was a little bit ahead, and only near the end here, suddenly you had a huge increase of Barak's leading. This concludes this game. In the meantime, let's see what is happening at the grecochess 64 tournament, the tournament that I'm organizing now. While the grecochess 16 players started 4 groups of 4 and the 4 finalists, here we start with 64 players, 16 groups of 4 to begin with. And the round number 1 is near the end. Unfortunately, I was eliminated, as you see here. I was third in my group. Oh, I need to see how many games remaining. Last time I checked was 16. Yes, 16 games remaining. Dual pairings, you'll see that in most groups we know has advanced. Guy Jordan, Sienna 78, Miguel Cracks, F1954 Alex, Lelio 69, Roberto 3515, Srajput, Mr. Hajif, Petla 68, Bossy Stand By Me, at Daniel 97, Hazelhurst Keats, Kalogero 81, Xilo Hu Bing, and Jilan Jilan. We have at least 2 ties, meaning at least 18 players will be at the next round, which means that we'll have to have a 4th round. If we have 18 players, then we'll have 5 groups in the second round instead of 4, which means we're going to have at least 5 players in the 3rd round, and this will not be the final, but the semi-final. But that's it for now. What's going to be in the next video? Let's go to the bots and see how things are going here. As we mentioned earlier, we have just eliminated Lee from Taiwan. And when I say eliminated, it means that finally we were able to defeat Lee twice, once the white and once the black pieces. But to do so, we suffered a total of 3 defeats. But that's what we'll do now. We'll play until we win or we give up. Once I was almost ready to give up because I tried 7 times to defeat my opponent, lost one after the other, but just when I had given up, privately, I faced this player again once more and I was able to win. Next one is Charles from England. Both number 17, the advanced number 17, or totally number 47. Then what remains? Charles from England, then it is Fatina from Lebanon, and then the 2100 boats manual from Portugal and Oscar from Sweden. And if we can defeat them, a huge if, we're talking about the master ones. The 2200 boats, the 2300 boats, the 2450. I wonder how well can we do with this thing. And then if we, which I doubt is going to happen, we might think of facing the top player. Also, if you have not yet seen the source videos, we have hundreds of views there. What's happening is I'm going through the puzzle rush, but now with a 3-minute limit so that it can qualify for source. And you can see there what I have been doing, and you may want to challenge yourselves and try to solve the same problems I have been solving. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. Thanks to the subscribers. If you have not subscribed, please consider doing so. Thanks to the comments and the likes. This is grecochess. I'm your host, Harry Lauseniziris. Goodbye.